Shalom and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. This is a recording of a Shabbat teaching by Rabbi Adam Kligfeld and by Rabbi Rebecca Schatz.
Shabbat Shalom. I'm going to give a very brief prefatory remark before we actually jump into the learning. Perhaps more than any other time in my career, this is now my 21st year in the rabbinate, rabbis have to make a pretty conscientious decision, hopefully with wisdom and a sense of artfulness that will not be agreed upon by everyone to whom they're speaking to, as to when to let the headlines inform, guide, demand addressing from the bima, and when to let shul be a refuge from everything that is out there. Because of the moments we're living through in this country, and because of the ways in which we are just exposed to it differently than in a pre-digital era, you can make a good argument, you really could, that every word out of a rabbi's mouth, out of a religious leader's mouth when speaking to a flock, could be, should be, must be speaking to this American moment. That is a reasonable argument. The words of our tradition are supposed to speak to our consciences and speak to reality. And I understand both sides of the argument about whether or not the Torah is a political document. On the one hand, we believe our tradition to transcend partisan politics and transcend nationhood. But of course it was a political document in the sense that it was always wielded in order to create a better and more merciful, more just polity, more just society, which means that we could spend every Shabbat drash, every Shabbat video, certainly the ones surrounding momentous moments in our country like we live through today, speaking to them. And we're not. We're not going to do that every time. Not because we don't think it's important, not because we don't think the Torah has something to say about it, but because we also think that the Torah has merit lishma, for its own sake. And most of the time, more interested we are in telling you what the Torah says about any particular moment happening outside our windows. We want to infuse your life with the words and the values of Torah, and then have you live them out and act them out based on how your neshama understands them. I really do believe that most of the time that's a rabbi's role as a translator of the tradition. So there's a lot swirling in our society right now. There's a lot broken. There's a lot of fear. There's a lot that's momentous. And it will be waiting for us after Musaf. For now, we're going to study some Torah. Now, it's impossible not to make some of the connections in one's mind between the text that we're studying and what's happening out there, and have at it. We intend this as a conversation. This is a good old-fashioned Beitenu text study, as opposed to a more direct rabbinic sermon. We're going to share some ideas. And if there are things that we're speaking about that to you speak to this moment, let us hear them. But we want to make it very clear that our primary intention is to teach the tradition today. Right? And to share with you things that are percolating for us as we hear the Torah's grand voice and divine inspiration. Okay, that's the prefatory remark. There was a text sheet that was shared in the Shabbat email. You may have it in front of you, either digitally or on paper if you printed it out. And it begins with an expanded conversation, or we're going to have an expanded conversation of something that I wrote very briefly about this past Shabbat in the Jewish Journal's Table for Five. Right, that's the 250-word little Dvar Torah that 5 different teachers, rabbis, and educators are asked to write each week. So it's actually, I love the assignment because it's hard to be brief, but it's good to be brief because it means that you're choosing your words very carefully. And in that Table for Five, I spoke about the profound moral challenge that hovers over the entire Exodus story, particularly as we want to read the story informed by, inspired by, devoted to a God that we want to believe is a benevolent God, a just God, a compassionate God, for pounding the Egyptians, not only for their earned sins of oppressing the Israelites, fine, that's justice, but pounding the Egyptians and pounding Pharaoh for a sin that seems to have been forced by God's own hand. The playfulness back and forth within the plagues of who is responsible for hardening Pharaoh's heart. It's playful in the language, but it's profound in how it challenges us. We do not want to think of our God as a malicious master of marionettes, forcing us to do X and then punishing us for X. In the same way, it would be meaningless for us to imagine a God forcing us to do Y and then rewarding us for having done Y. It robs humanity from a sense of free will, and it robs us of the ability to see justice meted out when it is due, as opposed to when it meted out willy-nilly by a puppeteer. And it's impossible to read these texts without lingering in that. So the way in we're going to be is chapter 9 of the book of Exodus, verse 35. I don't have the Chumash right in front of me. If someone has a page number for that. Chapter 9 of Exodus, verse 35. It's within Parshat Vaera. And it's at the top of the text sheet that we shared with you. But I'll do every text out loud to make sure that even if you don't have it in front of you, you can follow along. Vayechazak lev paro. I could spend an hour on that phrase because you know I love grammar. Chazak, chet, zayin, kuf is an interesting verb. Grammatically, it's called a stative verb in the sense that it represents a state of being more than it's an action item. And the form of this is interesting. The subject of Vayechazak is not Pharaoh and it's not God. It's Lev Paro, the heart of Pharaoh. So the heart of Pharaoh is so hard to translate in English. Got strong, got hard, hardened itself. It's not reflexive. It's not Vayitchazek. It strengthened itself. I gave you two translations amongst the many you could have. I wonder if Lara and Diane have the Aryeh Kaplan translation in front of them. The JPS translation is so Pharaoh's heart stiffened. Pretty good, because the subject is Pharaoh's heart, and Vayechazak became hard, became stiffened. And v'lo shilach et bnei Israel, he would not send away the Israelites. Ka'asher diber Adonai biad Moshe. This is a part we're going to get to later. Just as God had spoken through the hand of Moshe. God had predicted this hardening. That's a moral problem. It's a moral problem to imagine that God knew this was going to happen, and even more of a moral problem if God was part of it happening. Everett Fox, who has one of the most beautiful translations of the Torah, does something sweet here, or interesting. Pharaoh's heart, so he agrees that Pharaoh's heart is the subject, remained strong-willed. I love that as a translation of Vayechazak, suggesting that it's not that something happened in that moment, but something continued. It continued to be closed off to the notion of compassion. And he did not send the children of Israel free, as Everett Fox always transliterates Yud He Vav He as Yud YHWH, as God had spoken through Moshe. Okay. So again, we have several issues in the verse. One, what was actually happening in this hardening moment? And two, what is God's role? And 2A is, how much of this did God know was going to happen in advance? I want to bring you two sources. And again, this is not a lecture. I know it's hard on Zoom, but please interrupt me. Raise your hand. For those of you who are in my Rashi class, do it that way. Like, let me know you want to say something. I have much to say, but I do not want this to be only me today. I want to read the commentary of Rabbi Avadio Sforno, a 15th century Italian commentator, and then earlier than Sforno, but a rather late Midrashic collection. Hear some of your reactions to it, and then pass it along to Rabbi Schatz. Rabbi Sforno says something very subtle here, and I want your help. I mean that somewhat tongue-in-cheek. I think I understand what he's saying, but I want your help in drawing out what's the significance of his commentary and what he's troubled by in our verse and how he's resolving it. Vayechazak lev paro. Pharaoh's heart hardened or stiffened, however you want to translate it. Lo me'atzmo. Not on its own. Already Sforno is saying here that there's a dynamic happening. This is not just a human being feeling stubborn. It is a human being expressing stubbornness, but it's not just that he happened on its own. Aval, but ka'asher deep. And by the way, if there's a Hebrew and English here. It was a short Friday. The English is the English of the Sforno as presented on Sefaria. It is not my translation. I only realized after I shared the document that the English here is what's the word? It's not an exact translation.
Summary.
It's a summary. I'm missing another word. So I'm going to translate the Hebrew directly. The English goes pretty close to it, but if you know Hebrew and you're wondering why they don't match up, whoever gave this one out is trying to give a sense of what Sforno said, but it's not a word-by-word translation. Aval kasher diber Adonai biad Moshe. I'm going to add emphasis. Just as God had spoken, biad Moshe, through the hand of Moshe, to Moshe. Kodem shetziref et Aharon imo, before Aaron got connected to Moses in this act. You may not know the word siref like that, but you might know the word lehitztaref. Lehitztaref is to join oneself. So tzadi resh pei means to join. Sha'amarlo, for God had said earlier on in the 3rd chapter of Shemot, this is at the burning bush, which is exactly where we are in our Rashi class. Va'ani adati, God said to Moshe, I know, ki lo yitein etchem, melech Mitzrayim lahaloch. I know in advance that the king of Egypt is not going to let yourself go. Now, on the one hand, you could pause and say, that's not God manipulating a human being. That's God knowing a human being. I know this guy wants to hold on to power. I know he's not going to say, oh, you want my free workforce to go? Fine, have them go. So you could imagine God at this point saying, I can imagine that this Pharaoh is not going to easily let loose his grip on these reins. And this is now in parentheses, Sforno's explanation of that verse. Shalo yanichechem lahaloch birtzono. I know that he is not going to let you guys go of his own will. Now back to the quote from the verse at the burning bush. Velo biyada chazaka. It's a very interesting addition. If you're just studying that verse, you could ask the question, what does the phrase, and not via a strong hand, add to the phrase, I know that he will not let you go? And I want to ask you that question before we see Sforno's answer. Just imagine you're studying the 3rd chapter of Shemot, verse 19, which our Rashi class will get to. And I don't know how long we're on verse 4 now. How long will it take us to get 15 verses? Maybe a year and a half. What does it add when God said to Moses, I know that the king of Egypt will not allow you to go, comma, and not via a strong hand? What does the phrase, and not via a strong hand, add to God's statement? Who's got a thought? Is anyone's hand up? I can't tell.
Not yet.
I know you have thoughts. I just want you to share them. I should keep going? Karen, bavakasha. You can't unmute?
Yeah, now?
Yeah, now. Yeah. Okay, so what does that add?
Well, if he's not doing it voluntarily, who's doing it? Pharaoh's
say more.
Let them go by his own will. I'm going to intervene, it seems like God is saying.
Aha. But, okay, so I'm with you on like the general understanding of the story, Karen. What I'm having a hard time understanding is what the word velo and not means in this verse. Because again, what the verse is saying is, I know that the king of Egypt will not let you go, comma, and not by means of a strong hand. If it said biyada chazaka, by means of a strong hand, you could read it as, I know he's not going to let you go, therefore I'm going to give you my strong hand. But what's the, and not by means of a strong hand? Other possibilities? I see Tamar, and then I see Jen, and then I see Jeff. Tamar, Jen, Jeff.
Kenji, if it's easier for you at this point to just let people unmute, we can do that.
Yeah. But Karen, you can now mute again.
Yeah, she's muted.
All right, Tamar?
Yes. Could it mean not even with many punishments, with many inducements?
Very interesting. Okay, so probably the easiest shot here is, I know that he's not going to let you go, not even if I flex my strong hand. Okay, good. Hold on to that, because that will be like adjacent to what Sforno says. Jen, and then Jeff?
I was basically just going to say the same thing as Tamar, meaning that the process, I think that what Sforno is talking about, that there has to be a process. So it's not just going to be because I said so, meaning God's strong hand is I said so. So that there is going to be more to what needs to happen for Pharaoh to allow the Israelites to go.
Good. So you're actually anticipating Sforno. We haven't even gotten to Sforno's comments on it, but that's the direct. What you're saying is the phrase "velo biyada chazaka" is, it's not going to be by pure force. I could make it happen biyad chazakah, right? This is a different reading than Tamar. Tamar is saying, God is saying, even if I exert brute force, he's not going to change his mind. Another way of reading it is, I'm aware that I could make it happen, but it's not going to happen just by means of my doing this. Okay, Jeff, and then we'll keep reading the Sforno.
So I was thinking maybe it's a change, and God is now addressing Moses on behalf of the people, which is, you may think that you can, as a people, revolt, take up arms, and do this on your own, but that's not how it's going to happen.
Good, interesting, and timely, right? So you could read that the lo biyada chazakah as a wink to the people who might try to make this happen on their own. He's not going to let you go, and even if, forget about my flexed arms, even if you try to flex your muscles. Good. Now let's see what Sforno says, which is closest. Let's just see what he says. Ve'ertzeh, what I wish, what I want to happen, God says. This is now Sforno interpreting God's voice. Shelo ya'aseh ze meyirat yada chazakah. So subtle. I don't want this to happen merely because of Pharaoh's fear of my punishments. I could make him afraid enough on the first go around and basically force him to do it. I don't want that to happen. I don't want that to happen. The association that comes to mind is the crazy process that happens when, in the Jewish tradition, when a husband refuses to give a get to his wife. The tradition says that the one thing that can't happen, even though we want it to happen, is he can't be forced into doing it. It can't be, if the husband is literally forced into doing it, it's called a get ma'us. It's a get against his will, and tragically, it's not valid. You can cajole, you can put pressure, you can induce, you can convince, you can lead them to it. If you force his hand to write it, she's not free. It's almost as if God is saying this. The one thing I'm not going to do is literally force his hand, even though in this situation they would be free, they'd be out. God doesn't want that. Why? According to Sforno, this is continuing the previous thought. Shelo yuchal l'savla. I don't want it to be out of his fear of my strong hand that he's afraid he will not be able to endure, like that he's about to be threatened with a suffering that's too much. V'chein asa b'zeh hamakom. That is why Hamakom, this is the name of God referring to the omnipresent that you often hear in a blessing to someone who's in mourning. The one who is everywhere, therefore, decided to do the following. Ki achar shehosif lachato b'mezid. After Pharaoh continued to sin willingly, intentionally, right? He was allowed to keep sinning because God didn't threaten him from the very beginning with the worst thing he could threaten with, because God didn't want Pharaoh to let them go simply out of fear of God's punishments. And then Pharaoh's self continued to harden his heart, neged tiv'o, almost against his own will. Aval haya misupak, but Pharaoh was doubtful. He was not sure. Im yuchal lisbol. This is an interesting way of phrasing it. What I think this Sforno means here is, it's not that Pharaoh was certain he couldn't tolerate the coming decrees. It's almost as like, frogs was the last one. Could the next one be much worse than that? Maybe I would, or reverse, frogs, not that bad. Maybe I can stand up to this God. Maybe I can keep hardening my heart. Because I have not yet been threatened with makat bechorot, the death of the firstborn. Maybe I can continue to act like a tyrant because I'm not being forced not to act like a tyrant, because God doesn't want to force the tyrant not to act like the tyrant. God eventually wants the tyrant on some level to recognize the intrinsic punishment of being a tyrant and therefore maybe become a penitent. He strengthened or hardened his heart in that regard. Asher diber Adonai biad Moshe, just God had anticipated and said to Moshe. V'sam belibo, Pharaoh put in his heart, shelo yosif od lahakoto, that Pharaoh decided in his mind that there was nothing more that God could do to him. There's a subtlety here. For some reason, Sforno wants to read God here as wanting to hold back some of his power so that Pharaoh could intermittently delude himself into thinking that he'd eventually be able to be victorious, and over time realize he couldn't and start to engage in his own tshuva process as well. This is a choice. Sforno does not have to read in this way. And this is what I hinted at in my shorter table for 5. Sforno wants to help us see Pharaoh in a process. I forgot who said the word process originally. From tyrant, again, to penitent. Almost as an example of how the worst person in a scene can start recognizing the limits of his or her own power and begin to have a little bit of remorse, which would not happen if God forced the issue. If God forced the issue on plague 1, you would never see an interesting Pharaoh. You would just see a crushed Pharaoh. We want to see a crushed Pharaoh because he's been crushing us. God says the more interesting thing is to see a Pharaoh who slowly begins to realize that his power is ebbing and therefore becomes, believe it or not, a model for recognizing when you are losing authority. That took more time than I thought. Quickly, in the Midrash Lekach Tov, this is a 12th century Midrash, a collection of Midrashim written by Tobiah ben Eliezer. One thing that's interesting about this Midrash is that nearly every Midrash in this collection begins with a verse that has the word Tov in it, because his name was Tobiah. And so that was his shtick, that his Midrashim began with verses from the Bible that had the word Tov in it, and he connected it to what he was speaking of in real time. And again, he lived in Germany and what's now either southwestern Bulgaria or northeastern Greece. Vayachazek Adonai et lev Paro. That's our verse, that the heart of Pharaoh strengthened. Betchila, in the beginning, meaning earlier on in the plague cycle, it said Vayachazek lev Paro, that it's Pharaoh's heart is strengthening. Ulavasof, later on, we're going to get there. Vayachazek Adonai et lev Paro. God is doing the strengthening. Right? So, or the hardening. I made reference to this in my table for 5 as well, that in the beginning, it seems that Pharaoh is doing it on his own. It's only later on that God seems to be the puppeteer. Hainu da'amar, this is similar to what was said by Reish Lakish, Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, in the Babylonian Talmud, page 104a. Ba litma potchinlo. A very hard and inscrutable 4-word phrase. When somebody comes, ba litma, to do something impure, potchinlo, they open for him, they permit him, they let him. Who is the they? It's unclear. Something like the universe, the forces, the angels, God. If someone has intent to do something impure and wrong, no one's stopping him on a spiritual level. L'chein amar Yechezkel, similar to what our Haftorah, today's prophet, said in chapter 3, v'natachti michshol lefanav, that basically if someone comes, and particularly a false prophet comes to do the wrong thing, I, God, will place a stumbling block before him, meaning I'm going to let him trip and fall. Why? So that he learns something from it, rather than just force him into the good. The Omer, and Yechezkel, Ezekiel says later on, Va'anochi patiti et hanaviyahu. It is I who seduced this prophet, which what this Midrash is reading out of context is, I let this prophet continue to spew all these falsehoods because it is not my job, says God, to force those doing wrong to do the right. My job is to create a world where those doing wrong eventually see that they have to do something different if they want to do the right. Shekevan she'adam achafetz barasha, when a person wishes to do evil, hu nichshal min hashamayim, he's allowed to fail from the heavens. Did the heavens ever reach out to you when you were about to commit a sin? About to say or do something you shouldn't do? No. You're allowed to do it. But, Reish Lakish continues, uva lihitaher, but when you finally come to do something towards the pure, misayin lo, you're helped. There's a difference between you're permitted and you're helped. The heavens in this fantasy are going to permit you to screw up. But when you finally find the path to the right on your own, that's when God gets involved, gives you a push in the tuchus. and tries to help society towards that which is the greater good. Rabbi Schatz?
So Rabbi Kligfeld, I have a question. Do you want to finish the sources that you brought, and I can do mine next week since it will continue as part of our narrative, or do you want me to go through mine very quickly since it's already 12:05? It's
a good question. I'm basically through my sources. The next two sources are just the longer verses from the chapter of Ezekiel, but let's do the following. Let me see what reactions are, because if there are 3 to 4 minutes of reactions from the Kahal, I'd rather hear them, and then I'd love to do part 2 with you next week. So,
great. Okay.
What does this bring up for you out there in terms of your understanding of the story, your understanding of the morality that Sforno and Midrash Lekach Tov are dealing with, and if you want, what it's saying about the world and today? Larry, Diane, and then Karen.
Perhaps that there are those who are incapable of being not just convinced, but of repentance. And the lesson is that they exist, and they are the ones for whom only through force can we actually accomplish anything good at all.
Yeah. Good. So what I infer from your statement is that the preferred way in God's world is for it not to result in that, or not to end up in that. The preferred way is for the light to be seen by people's own recognition of the natural consequences of their cruelty or their nefariousness. But if they don't, then eventually there's a 10th plague. Is that basically the thing?
Not only the preferred way. I don't want to teach you the lesson God is saying that you can get something by force, or you should get something by force. Because that would be even more disastrous, because then both the evildoer and the one who is trying to resolve or improve the situation end up doing evil by force. You must first try to convince in some way, and only after, and here we have 10 examples, 10 times maybe you could even say, you have to go to the center 10 times to get them to repent, and only after 10 opportunities are you allowed then to use the ultimate force and say, okay, away with you, there's nothing to be done.
Larry, that's a great read of Sforno. It's a great commentary on Sforno's commentary. It seems to be like the medieval commentaries version of the witticism that ends with God saying, "I sent you the car, the canoe, and the airplane." Like we're having Sforno's having us see God as begging Pharaoh to do his own tshuva. Like I could end you, Pharaoh, but I'm not. I'm actually allowing for more oppression to happen so that maybe you can show that you're willing to learn something. You didn't? Okay, 10th plague. Karen, and then Norm, and then Rabbi Susan Lemley.
I think maybe I misunderstood you, because when we read about allowing Pharaoh to be penitent, he wasn't. He didn't say, "Oh, I'm so, look what I've done to these people, and I'm so sorry," blah, blah, blah. It was, I don't want to say it, you, God, but, you didn't do it. I mean, go ahead, give me the next shot.
Right.
So it's not, I don't see how he came to his own, like Larry was saying, it's almost like, okay, you didn't this time too? Fine. Now I'm really going to show you.
If we did a true slow read through these verses, it's possible to see that in reaction to these smaller plagues, that you have Pharaoh reconsidering his position. There seems to be a willingness, and then a stiffening. Like there is a dynamic. He is doing a bit of both. Now, is he only doing it because he wants to like appease the one who's punishing him and just get rid of the plague, or is he saying, "Oh, maybe I should rethink my ways here"? No, I'm not willing to do so. So it is actually Sforno is getting this from somewhere. It is possible to see Pharaoh as trying to make sense of whether or not his way in the world is workable. Right?
Forgive me for saying Pharaoh's a narcissist. Just saying. And he has a lot of power, and he's not giving it up, and he's not going to say, "You have more than I have."
I forgive you. I pardon you.
Okay, thank you.
Norm, and then Rabbi Susan Lemley.
I'm inclined to feel that God could see what was happening to Pharaoh much more easily, and he probably expended time and effort on maybe 8 more plagues than he needed to, maybe 9, and that was it worth it to try and get Pharaoh to repent for us to have to suffer increasingly and longer before we finally were liberated? I question God about that based on Sforno.
Good. Right. So what Sforno exposes in his commentary is that very critique norm, right? That if that's God's uber methodology to try to kind of nudge Pharaoh into being somehow a model for penitence, there is suffering and death as a result of that trial. And that's hard to live with. So it's very astute of you to sort of not critique Sforno, but critique the implication of Sforno's read of the story. Good. Rabbi Susan?
I like very much your idea that when we go to do something wrong, God won't jump in to keep us from doing it. But when we go to do something right, there will be some lift.
Yeah.
And I think that conforms in a way with my experience, that when you go and you do something right, or it often typically makes you feel good. You feel at home, you feel harmonious. I would suggest, and actually it conforms with my experience I have had during this pandemic, that when it's not exactly the same thing, but when it seems like all is dreadful, I get some sense that underneath it all, there is something that will turn it around. Eventually. That eventual turnaround is God.
Yeah. Thank you for that. So you said you like my read of that. You're liking Reish Lakish's read of that. And Reish Lakish, he's saying something stronger than the more parav and witty and banal expression of a similar idea in Pirkei Avot. In Pirkei Avot, it says, mitzvah goreret mitzvah. If you do a mitzvah, it's going to lead you to do another one. Vaera goreret Vaera. And if you do a transgression, you're going to be led in that direction, right? Like basically every step increases the chances of the next step, right? And there is a habituation to our behaviors. What Reish Lakish is saying, but I at least want to believe or fantasize about a world that there's more from the heavens pulling me towards the good. I will be permitted to trod the path of the bad, but if I finally get on the path towards the good, that God is with me, and that's stronger than Pirkei Avot. Joanna, sorry. Okay, so Joanna, then Gabriella, and then we're going to end. And I'm sorry we're not going to have time for everybody.
This discussion is taking me to another piece of this week's Parsha, to other people who didn't listen to Moshe, which is Bnei Yisrael. There's a description of Bnei Yisrael not being able to listen to Moshe because, interestingly, from a physical body description to a spiritual, because of their kotzer ruach, because of their short spirit. And this isn't a fully formulated thought yet, but like the comparison of when you either can't or won't listen to God and what the difference is there. And what is it that we draw from here? Because we too were in Mitzrayim because we were being punished by God. So how do we compare and contrast this in terms of the redemption, doing some sense of tshuva and some sense of when we no longer have this state of kotzer ruach, what does that mean for our relationship with God?
Yeah, great. I'm gonna leave that as an unanswered question, but a wonderful near coda to this conversation. Thank you for that, Gabriella.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you. I'm a little confused because, on the one hand, you're saying that somehow Pharaoh relented and let our people go, but he didn't really. He sent the chariots after us, so he never really relented. It was just that Hashem defeated him and allowed us to go through the Sea of Reeds.
Right. So even after the process that Larry was talking about before of waiting to see if Pharaoh would come to this on his own through smaller punishments, and then God actually flexing the large muscles and bringing out the big tanks for the 10th plague, even then Pharaoh is basically showing, don't look to me as your idol, as your model of a penitent, because even after the worst has been thrown at me, I'm still not willing to let go. Right. So, but I think what Sforno is saying is that God was hoping for a different outcome. God didn't want to force it from the very beginning. That's that phrase, "V'lo bi'ada chazaka." I don't want it to I don't want it to be the situation that he's going to let you go only because I forced him. I would rather Pharaoh learn something. You would say in Talmudic language, "Kamash malan." Unfortunately, the story teaches us that Pharaoh was unable, or Pharaoh was unwilling, as some people are.
Well, I think you have to, I mean, I don't want to give Pharaoh any credit, but you can see that from a point of view of an absolute ruler, if he allows one people to get out of slavery, where he has other slaves, many other slaves, he doesn't want to encourage them. So it's kind of an impossible situation for Pharaoh or for any absolute ruler.
Of course.
They want power, and that's they have a hard time relinquishing.
If I mean, let's just say it even more plainly. If you're a slave owner, right? If you allow one of your slaves to go, then oh my, they might all go.
Yeah, well, that was
right?
their fear. That was people's fear. Of course, you'd go into history, and there were some people who did let some of this go, or all of them. But in a sense, if somebody wants to be a tyrant and is so afraid of his system falling apart, then there's really no hope for him relenting in one part.
Yeah.
But that's the
I was going to give Gabrielle the last word, but I saw Dvora's hand up, and I love that you're part of this conversation, Dvora. So Dvora, if you, please unmute and say what you're going to say, and then we'll conclude if you're still there.
I'm still here, and I'm getting a little frustrated because I think we're tiptoeing around what you want to present with how we're living now, okay? We have a leader that told lies, and he had his supporters, and God did not interfere, and we were feeling powerless. And when this leader lost his voice and he was taken off of Twitter, so to speak, he suddenly felt that he had a loss of power. And I think that was the defining moment in our society when a leader wanted to be an authoritarian, but realizing that we definitely do live in a democracy. And I think that was the turning point. Whether God had a hand in that, I don't know. Because I think God does have a hand, but not always, because we have free will. And those things happen because the people are in control. And when he lost that voice, he seemed to have lost his control. And I think we've been tipping-toeing around this because it seems to me that when you started your drash, you started it because of the times that we're living in. And no one was willing to relate to that. And I was becoming a little frustrated.
Thank you, Dvora. Every teaching of Torah and every verse of the Torah can be a Rorschach test, right? That people see it in a particular shape, and they're certain and adamant that's the exact shape that it is. And I appreciate your comment and your contribution. I actually intended for this to be a conversation in intentional generalities. About important things, about the limits of power, about the hopes that a God-present world, a world in which God is present, is that even pharaohs amongst us, and there are pharaohs in the world, will eventually be brought to tshuva without the worst and the most severe of punishments brought down on them beforehand. I do like the idea that God wanted to spare even a pharaoh from the worst of punishments. He couldn't otherwise. God couldn't. But let's have it kind of end here as we're all thinking about the ways in which this notion of the universe sometimes inviting us to change our ways and move in a more just direction originally sometimes begins with a nudge, and then it becomes with a push. And we should listen earlier on rather than wait for the final blow.
You have been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast site or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about Temple Beth Am Los Angeles, go to tbala.org.